If you're into Marvel vs. Capcom, there's a chance that either Marvel 2 or 3 are the games in the series that you're most familiar with. So for this video, I wanted to take it way back to the 90s and re-examine the first video game I ever played. 1996's X-Men vs. Street Fighter was the first true Marvel vs. Capcom title, as although Children of the Atom and Marvel Superheroes featured Akuma and Anita respectively, neither of these games heavily advertised their inclusion. On the other hand, X-Men vs. Street Fighter went all out, going balls to the wall when demonstrating its insanity to audiences, and I still remember how cool it all looked when I was a little kid in the arcade. With how beloved the title is, it's a bit of a head-scratcher as to why Capcom never ported it to any systems throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Home console versions do exist, mind you, and we'll look at them later on, so stay tuned, but there was no official way to play the game on modern hardware until 2024's Marvel vs. Capcom collection, and thank God for this. It's now easier than ever to give X-Men vs. Street Fighter a go and test its infamous gameplay properties, and it just wouldn't be Marvel vs. Capcom without absurd meter gain, infinites, and screen-filling supers. With all of that out of the way, let's learn more about X-Men vs. Street Fighter. If you've seen my other videos, then you'll know that now's about the time we would discuss the background and development of the game, but let's do something different for now. For starters, X-Men vs. Street Fighter has 6 attack buttons, a stark contrast to the aforementioned Marvel 2 and 3. 3 punches and 3 kicks are how you'll do battle, and when combined with motion inputs, you can perform either command normals, specials, or supers. The button layout will be instantly familiar to Street Fighter fans, and as the series was making boatloads of money in the 90s, this was a wise choice. The Magic Series system makes a return too, and this lets you freely chain normals together in ascending order, even in the air. Magic Series routes provide characters with ways to meaningfully participate in battle in situations where they would never normally be able to, providing new strategies to even the oldest of fighters. You'll also notice that there are glaringly obvious meters in the bottom corners of the screen, and although meter is used for many systems in future games, not all of them show up here, so keep that in mind. As the sequel to Children of the Atom, X-Men vs. Street Fighter's gameplay underwent significant updates, with the most obvious being the brand new tag team system. But before we get into that, I'd like to highlight how the characters themselves received many upgrades in the form of new and improved moves. Wolverine, for example, now has his iconic Berserker Barrage, which wasn't in Coda, and the Street Fighter characters now function on steroids. All of their moves are significantly larger than how they appear in their series of origin, and this phenomenon makes Ryu feel more like Goku. Shin Ryuken and Kikosho also spring to mind when thinking of their biggest Street Fighter super, and don't even get me started on Zangief. This dude causes an explosion when he slams you into the ground, helping to sell the move's intense impact. The upgraded attacks are twofold, as not only do they help to attract new players through flashy and exciting spectacles, but they also serve as an evolution of the Street Fighter series. Verticality is a major component of Marvel, with air dashes, air blocking, double jumps, etc., but not so much in Street Fighter, so when they decide to do battle with literal superheroes and mutants, their A-game must be brought. I believe that buffing the Capcom characters in such a way that makes their battles believable without making them overpowered goes a long way when authenticity is on the line. In simpler terms, you'll never hear anyone say, well, this doesn't make sense, Cammy would never be able to keep up with Magneto. If Capcom kept the Street Fighter characters the exact same, this would be a valid criticism, but I don't see Cammy doing this in Super Turbo. Switching over to the Marvel side of things, it's awesome seeing classic X-Men figures show up here. Coda veteran Psylocke and Colossus have been cut, but their departure made way for other fan favorites. Rogue, Gambit, and Sabretooth are the X-Men newcomers, with the others returning from Coda. In my view, it wouldn't be Marvel vs. Capcom had these fighters never made it into X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and Gambit was always my favorite of the bunch. He's animated so beautifully with his giant staff, and doing big damage supers is endlessly satisfying. Putting my Gambit bias aside for a moment, this also applies to every character in the game, as they ooze with personality through fluid animation, memorable sound design, and intuitive movesets. These two franchises may seem radically different, so much so to the point where a crossover doesn't seem like it would work on paper, but Capcom somehow pulled it off. No matter how different the fighters can be in terms of tier lists and game balance, each of them have attacks that are impactful, tying them all together, and the action becomes even more seizure-inducing when they bring their partner into play. Now's about the time where I would explain how assists work, but they're not in this game. Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter was the game that introduced the assist mechanic, where you press 2 buttons to briefly summon your teammate, not this game. But with that being said, there are meaningful ways for your sub-character to participate. If they don't get knocked out, that is, because if this happens, you're on your own, so watch out. The simplest tag system is the hard tag, and it's exactly what it looks like. Forcing your partner in has many reasons behind it. Maybe you want to regain red life with your point character, or perhaps you want to have an easier matchup, but one thing you have to keep in mind is to not get predictable. Hard tags are unsafe on block despite their pushback, so you just might lose a character if performed at the wrong time. Going back to meter, you can perform an alpha counter for 1 bar or a team super for 2. The former serves as both a hard tag and escape tool, with the latter being used for big damage. Part of team synergy involves finding 2 characters with supers that complement each other, as there are some that don't work well from different ranges. This means that there are no snapbacks or the unintentional behaviors that come with them, and I wouldn't be surprised if this messed with the muscle memory of a Marvel 2 player. DHCs are also nowhere to be found, so you can't do the classic trick of doing an unsafe super and then bringing Storm in to make it safe. When you go beyond the surface level in your observations, you realize that the lack of these mechanics makes X-Men vs Street Fighter remarkably different to future MVC games, and I never realized how much of an impact this would all have until I started working on this video. I've played this game many times over the years, but I never really gave these qualities much thought, to be honest. Perhaps the most infamous of these involves air actions, as players can only input one per normal jump. You see guard break setups all the time in games like Marvel 2 and 3, and although they're in this game, there's another technique that you can use. When your opponent is coming in, jump back and throw out a move that hits them as soon as they appear on screen. As far as I can tell, the game will prevent them from blocking in this scenario, allowing the attacker to follow up with whatever they like. With how hyper I've made X-Men vs Street Fighter sound, you may think that it's all about the offense, but with any great fighting game comes ways for players to defend against an onslaught of attacks, and that's exactly what you'll find here. In addition to basic movement tools like backdashing, super jumps, flight, etc., there exist push blocks and tech rolls, with both possessing advanced strategies. Super Combo Wiki is a fantastic resource to learn about them all in greater detail, but for now, allow me to explain my favorite, the push block all guard. When inputting a standing push block, immediately hold down. This makes your character block high and low at the same time, effectively making you strike invincible. Subtle tech like that is what separates the newcomers from the experienced players in these old school fighting games, and it was good fun testing it all out in training mode. Before we move on, I'll also elaborate about the more broken qualities of the title. It's no secret that updated arcade board revisions were released in order to tone down certain infinites and otherwise unintentional behavior, but if you go back to version 1.0, there is a lot of busted stuff to be found. Lord knows I don't have the hand-eye coordination to execute any of it, but there are plenty of crazy videos online you can watch to further your understanding of the game's limits, and I have to recommend the old Toxie combo videos. This dude is a beast, and I would know, I've actually met him before. It turns out that Toxie goes to the same locals that I do, and after playing X-Men vs Street Fighter with him a few times, I can confirm that he's still a beast, he's still got it. Definitely check his stuff out if you want to learn more, because a zoomer like me has no chance of ever doing combos like this. Now that we know how wild the average match of X-Men vs Street Fighter can be, how did it all come about? Why did Capcom decide to make a crossover sequel to Children of the Atom? For the longest time, details surrounding the title's development were scarce, but thanks to the release of the MVC collection, development staff at Capcom have gone back and shed some light over the game's more obscure production details, with outlets, event hubs, and Polygon making these reports easily accessible. After Marvel and Capcom's successful business collaborations on arcade games like The Punisher and Children of the Atom, their relationship was better than ever, leading to both parties being more than happy to continue working with one another. According to the Polygon article Children of the Atom, An Oral History, former head of creative services at Marvel, Dana Moorehead, claimed X-Men vs Street Fighter was unique in that it was the first time both companies had to sort out a character crossover in terms of licensing. Luckily for us, they were eager to develop a new project, and I assume development began sometime during the first half of 1995, after Coda's release. What's important to note is that although Coda and Marvel superheroes were great successes in the West, they didn't fare so well in Japan, mostly due to Marvel's lack of popularity in the region at the time. This will come into play later, so make sure you remember it. Speaking of Coda, after working on the title as a sub-planner, Capcom's Atsushi Tomita found himself being promoted to the role of a main planner, and this granted him access to secret information about the next Capcom-developed X-Men fighting game. Remember how Akuma made an appearance in Coda as a playable fighter? Well, Capcom's idea was to expand on this, throwing even more Street Fighter characters onto the battlefield, and even though this would have sounded amazing on paper, the game's name wouldn't have reflected this sudden roster change. Originally, X-Men vs Street Fighter was called X-Men 2, but with how half of the roster was composed of Street Fighter characters, Tomita thought the name didn't fit, so he changed it to what we know today. After the name and character roster were decided on, it should have been smooth sailing, right? Wrong, and I've identified two major reasons as to why. Firstly, the development team had very strict deadlines to meet during production, so much so to the point where they intentionally left the game unbalanced. In a Twitter post, Tomita explains, "Due to lack of time, we basically abandoned balancing entirely, but the location test got amazingly positive feedback, and before development even ended, we were asked if we could do a sequel. Our focus was on making it very flashy, and feeling good to see extreme animations when you unleash your moves, and having a gameplay tempo that felt good as well. We put our all into realizing this in our short development period." I'm sure we've all heard stories of our favorite games being subject to time constraints, with the work ethic and natural talent of the developers coming in clutch to make X-Men vs Street Fighter extremely enjoyable despite the circumstances behind its creation. Going back to what I mentioned earlier regarding how the Street Fighter characters are now on steroids, the prime reason behind this phenomenon was to help it compete with Street Fighter Alpha in the visual department, as it would have looked like a rush job if both games had the same VFX. Visual and special effects designer Takafumi Sagata was instrumental behind the creation of these effects, with Tomita recalling, The first thing Mr. Sagata showed me was a yoga fire that reached the end of the screen, and I thought, what should I do here? But having him show me something as amazing as this, I felt like I had no choice but to just say okay and figure out the balancing of it later. And like that, the effects just became more and more extreme, and it kept escalating. The other reason behind the title's troubled development relates back to what I said before about Coda not performing well in Japan. Outside of its core development team, many Capcom employees were indifferent or even against the idea of their beloved Street Fighter characters swapping spit with the filthy Gaijin X-Men, and Tomita even recalls a co-worker saying, "A game like this shouldn't be known by anyone and just disappear quietly." Ouch, that's really harsh, so much for workplace morale. Anyway, the plan to make these versus fighters more popular in Japan focused solely on the inclusion of Street Fighter, with an Event Hub's article reporting as much when quoting Tomita. Including familiar faces during the 90s Street Fighter boom was a no-brainer, with the decision assuredly getting new fans involved in the series too. In a more light-hearted development recollection, the final boss, Apocalypse, is gigantic, shocking many players who were expecting a more traditional final boss. It turns out that this was originally the plan, but with how little memory the developers had left on their arcade board, some creativity was required. The CPS2 had a lot of memory for characters on the ROM, but we were already quite filled up with what we had, so rather than make him a regular fighting game character, we figured we could make him a huge character who didn't move at all in order to preserve on memory. We used that limitation to turn it into a special effect like that instead. Making a giant character with screen-filling special moves may seem like it would use even more memory, but as these games were created using black magic and a Japanese work ethic, I'm not gonna question it. I'd also like to briefly discuss some of X-Men vs Street Fighter's cut content. On the topic of Apocalypse, he originally had a move where his hand would generate a giant energy ball, but as the attack was never finished, it has no hitbox. In addition to this, there are unused text sprites present in the game files, including a single option. Perhaps it would have been possible to enjoy one-on-one battles? Beginner, expert, and manual sprites can also be found, and they seem to have been replaced by the normal turbo auto display in the final game. This last thing isn't cut content per se, but it heavily influenced the variable cross mechanic found in Marvel vs. Capcom 1. We didn't really have any new ideas for the game system itself, so I was thinking, what should I do? But then I remembered that back when our programmer, Ikawa-san, did the tag system for X-Men vs Street Fighter, there was a bug where two characters would stay on the screen. At the time, I thought, I'm definitely using this at some point, and when I remembered, we decided to make that into the variable cross. With hesitation within Capcom, half of the character roster being unpopular in its native Japan, and high expectations in the West, how did X-Men vs Street Fighter perform upon release? With how old the title is, it can be challenging to find reviews and general media coverage of X-Men vs Street Fighter's initial arcade release, but its home conversions to the Sega Saturn and PlayStation have an excess of resources for us to consult, so we'll get to them in a bit. In the very beginning, Japanese outlet Game Machine reported in their November 1996 issue that X-Men vs Street Fighter was the most profitable arcade game of October, and although this sounds fantastic, I wasn't able to find and verify the original source. Moving over to the West now, page 272 of Next Generation Magazine issue 24 contains a review for the game titled Comic. Very creative name there, guys. In the very first sentence, the author claims that X-Men vs Street Fighter is one of Capcom's least original fighting games, with its supposed button-mashing nature earning it a 3 out of 5. The overall sentiment of the review is that while the game was enjoyable, it just felt like more of the same instead of being a true innovation over Children of the Atom. The larger special moves and types of combos were also mentioned, indicating that even back on launch, these were major components of the fighting mechanics that players had yet to truly adjust to. Heading back to the aforementioned Polygon article, the bombastic nature of Coda's gameplay systems didn't immediately make sense to players, with Street Fighter purists finding it corny to do massive supers with multiple rapid hits. These types of players wanted something more like Street Fighter 2 or Alpha, so when Capcom gave them X-Men vs Street Fighter, it's fair to say that a few of them weren't very happy. The only other critical 90s Western review I found was from GameSpot, and despite them specifically focusing on the PS1 port, they had this to say about the entire game. Even if this were a perfect translation of the arcade game, the simple fact remains that X-Men vs Street Fighter is a terrible, unbalanced, pound-on-buttons-and-win-anyway fighting game. Now that we're on the topic of home ports, there's a general rule of thumb that every single review exhibits. Sega Saturn port? Good. PS1 port? Horrible. The history behind these two is that after the Japanese Saturn version was released with a console RAM expansion required to run the game properly, Capcom USA was like, okay, don't worry guys, the Saturn port will come out in the West, so just wait a bit. It was then that Sega cancelled the Western release of the RAM expansion, and to make matters worse, the financial failure of the Saturn led to many retailers completely removing all Saturn-related products, so Capcom was in a bit of a rough position. But hang on, that's just America, so what about other parts of the world, like Europe? Yeah, it wasn't great there either. Back in the 90s, Capcom relied on Virgin Interactive to handle the publishing of their games in Europe, and after Virgin refused to put up money for European production of the RAM expansion, the game couldn't be released there either. At this point, it seemed like the only home port of X-Men vs Street Fighter would be for the Japanese, and despite imports being available to us in the West, they weren't official if you get my drift. During November 1996, Capcom held a conference stating that the only home conversion of the game would be for the Saturn, but after many criticized them for their perceived favoritism towards Sega over other companies, they backed off and they decided to port the game to the PS1. And not only that, but this new version would also be released at home in the West. Hooray! Western gamers were finally able to experience an arcade-perfect conversion at home, right? Ah, if only, my sweet summer Sakura. Because the PS1 was developed primarily to handle 3D games, sprite-based titles often received the short end of the stick, with this port specifically being the best example. Put simply, Sony's beloved console didn't have the power required to run a game of this caliber, and the final product suffered heavily as a result. If you'd like to learn more, I have a video that covers this specific conversion in greater detail. The most positive PS1 review I could find was Game Informer's 7.5 out of 10, but this is the exception, not the rule. Many other outlets tore this game a new one, and rightfully so. It runs badly on the PS1, so badly in fact, to the point where the whole tag system had to be removed due to a lack of memory. At the end of the day, X-Men vs Street Fighter cannot and should not be a one-on-one fighter, but I understand the developers most likely did the best they could under the very precarious circumstances they would have found themselves under. However, reviewers didn't take this into consideration, with Next Generation returning to state, "If you've never seen a Capcom fighting game before, this might be fun for a few minutes, but there is not one single positive thing to be said for the trade-offs that Capcom made to get this game to PlayStation. If ever there was a wake-up call to Capcom to quit producing 2D brawlers for PlayStation, this is it. They already weren't too keen on the game with their original 3-star rating, but now they lowered it to 1 star. It's safe to say by now that PS1 gamers absolutely got screwed over, but if you were a cool 90s kid who had both consoles and the Christmas money to import the Japanese Saturn version, you would have had a good time. Reviews for this version are universally positive, with 9 out of 10 scores being very common, a stark contrast to the PS1. I've even heard users online claim that the Saturn version is arcade perfect, a rarity back in those days, so die-hard Capcom fans wouldn't want to miss it. For the longest time, X-Men vs Street Fighter was stuck on these platforms, and despite being playable online via Fightcade, there was no official way to play it on modern hardware. That is, until the 2020s, when something big happened. Something that every Marvel vs Capcom fan on the planet had been waiting for. Something that made me piss myself and wake up my parents. This was the arcade 1-up cabinets. These were announced in June 2020, and to be honest, I haven't heard many positive things. Putting its expensive barrier to entry aside, the netcode and overall technical performance of these machines don't have the greatest reputation, so instead of being X-Men vs Street Fighter's grand comeback, it ended up being a soft whimper. Until 2024, that is, when something big happened. Something that every yeah, it's the collection. Now that the Marvel collection is easily accessible on modern hardware, X-Men vs Street Fighter's arcade revisions are now accessible on home consoles. There's no more lag, cut features, technical limitations, etc., as consoles like the PS4 onwards can run this game in their sleep. I played the PC version of the collection to record footage for this video, and it was a breeze. Everything about the title here runs so smoothly, and you would be hard-pressed to find any major issues. I can even go into the settings if I feel like reverting back to an older revision with more infinites, which is fantastic for game documentation. Although X-Men vs Street Fighter never received a numbered sequel, it's now known as one of the elders of the overall Marvel vs Capcom series, so I have to pay my eternal respects to it. If my message isn't clear by now, it's me telling you to try the game out, you might like it. It was fun back then, and it's still really fun now, so you know that X-Men vs Street Fighter is a brilliantly designed fighting game classic. In my view, 90s Capcom was unbeatable in the art and audio department, with this game being one of the prime examples, and even after all these years, it looks, sounds, and plays beautifully. I've never really tried to learn the minutiae of X-Men vs Street Fighter's gameplay before, so diving deep into its systems for this video was a blast. I'm really happy that the developers ignored the negativity imposed onto them by other Capcom employees who didn't understand their vision. If they caved into the pressure and toned some of the more crazy gameplay elements down, the game would have felt sterile and unconfident, and the Marvel vs Capcom series as we know it today wouldn't even exist. So take this as a message to keep doing what you're doing and to not let others screw you over. I certainly wasn't expecting to gain life advice when writing this video, but I guess inspiration often comes from unexpected places, so I want you to channel your inner X-Men vs Street Fighter developer and leave your own unique mark on the world. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you and your time, and I hope you had fun. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.